What if the life we celebrated was only half the story, and the part we never saw was the one that truly mattered? On a quiet morning in Paris, the news arrived without warning. There were no flashing headlines at first, no dramatic scenes, no spectacle. Just a simple, almost understated report. Jane Birkin had been found dead in her home. Alone. It didn't feel right. This was a woman whose voice had echoed across decades, whose face had become a symbol of an entire era, whose presence seemed inseparable from life itself. Music, cinema, art, rebellion. And yet, in the end, there was only silence. A stillness that felt too complete, too absolute. But something didn't add up, because the version of Jane Birkin the world knew didn't seem like someone who would simply fade into quiet obscurity. Not like this, not without something more beneath the surface. For years, she had been described as effortless, natural, unfiltered. The woman who didn't try to be iconic, but became it anyway. Her voice, soft and almost fragile, carried a strange kind of power. Her image, never forced, became timeless. She wasn't just admired. She was mythologized. And yet myths have a way of hiding truths. In the days following her death, tributes poured in from across the world. Artists, musicians, filmmakers, all speaking of her brilliance, her authenticity, her spirit. They described her as free, as fearless, as someone who lived exactly as she wanted. But what they didn't tell us was how much of that freedom was real. Because behind every carefully remembered image, there are always moments that never make it into the story. The pauses, the doubts, the quiet fractures that don't photograph well. And that's where things become even stranger. Reports began to surface that Birkin had been struggling in her final years. Not publicly, not in the way that draws attention, but quietly. Withdrawn at times, physically weaker, emotionally more fragile than the world seemed to realize. Yet even that explanation felt incomplete. Because this wasn't just about aging, or illness, or the natural slowing down of a life once lived at full speed. There was something else, something harder to define, a pattern perhaps. If you looked closely, really closely, you could begin to see it. Small moments scattered across her life, decisions that didn't quite align, relationships that carried an undercurrent of imbalance, a kind of emotional weight that seemed to follow her no matter how brightly she appeared to shine. But no one talked about it openly. Instead, the narrative remained simple. She was the golden girl, the muse, the symbol of effortless beauty and artistic freedom. A life that others envied. A story that felt complete. Except it wasn't, because if her life had truly been what it seemed, why did it end like this? Why was there no sense of closure, only a quiet absence, as if something had already been slipping away long before anyone noticed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what if the version of Jane Birkin we remember was never the full picture? Because sometimes the most carefully constructed images are the ones that hide the deepest contradictions, the ones that convince us everything is whole, when something has already begun to fracture beneath the surface. And when you start to trace her story backward, away from the headlines, away from the myth, you begin to see something different. Not a sudden ending, but a slow, almost invisible unraveling. One that didn't begin in Paris. One that didn't begin in her final years. One that may have started much earlier, in a place far removed from the life she would later become known for. Because this story, despite how it ended, didn't begin here. Long before the name Jane Birkin became synonymous with effortless allure and artistic rebellion, There was simply a girl growing up in a world that already felt slightly out of place. She was born in London, into a household that seemed on the surface perfectly aligned with creativity and culture. Her mother, Judy Campbell, was a respected actress. Her father, David Birkin, carried a very different kind of life, disciplined, secretive, shaped by war and intelligence work. It was a contrast that would quietly define the atmosphere she grew up in. Art and restraint, expression and control existing side by side. But something about that environment didn't fully connect, because while creativity was present, emotional openness was not always guaranteed. The world she inhabited was structured, proper, almost careful in the way it revealed itself. And for someone like Birkin, sensitive, observant, instinctively drawn to feeling rather than form, it created an early tension, one that wouldn't fully surface until much later. At first, she followed a predictable path. Education, early exposure to theater, small roles that hinted at potential but didn't yet define her. She wasn't immediately extraordinary, not in the way some stars seem destined from the beginning. And that's where things become interesting, because her rise did not come from a clear, intentional pursuit of fame. It came from movement, displacement, a kind of drifting that slowly reshaped who she was. In the mid-1960s, she entered the world of film in England, appearing in productions that placed her on the edge of visibility. But even then, there was something uncertain about her presence. She didn't fit neatly into expectations. She wasn't polished in the traditional sense. Her voice, her demeanor, her way of existing on screen, it all felt slightly unrefined. And yet, that was exactly what made her different. But difference alone doesn't explain what happened next, because her life changed not through gradual progression, but through a sudden shift. A relocation that would alter not just her career, but her entire identity. France. It wasn't just a move across borders, it was a move into a completely different cultural rhythm, a different language, a different way of expressing emotion, art, and identity. And for Birkin, this transition wasn't seamless. In fact, at first it was disorienting. She didn't speak the language fluently. She wasn't fully understood. And perhaps more importantly, she didn't fully understand the world she had entered. There's something quietly destabilizing about that. Being seen, but not entirely known. Being present, but slightly out of sync. But something didn't add up. Because instead of pulling back, instead of retreating into familiarity, she leaned into it. Into the uncertainty, into the discomfort. Why? Because for the first time, she wasn't confined by the expectations of where she came from. In England, she was part of a system, structured, restrained, defined by subtle rules that governed how one should behave, speak, exist. In France, those rules were different, looser, more expressive, more willing to blur boundaries. And that's when something began to shift. Not all at once, not in a way that anyone could clearly point to, but gradually, almost invisibly, she started becoming someone else. Or perhaps more accurately, she allowed herself to be reshaped. And that's where the first real anomaly appears. Because when identity begins to change too quickly, too completely, it raises a quiet question. Is this transformation genuine, or is it a response to pressure, to environment, to something external shaping the outcome? At this stage in her life, Birkin wasn't yet the icon the world would come to know. She was still forming, still adapting, still searching for where she belonged. But the conditions around her were already setting the stage for something much larger and much more complicated, because France didn't just offer her opportunity. It offered her reinvention, And reinvention, while powerful, often comes with a cost. What gets left behind? What parts of the original self are quietly erased in the process? And more importantly, who decides what the new version should be? These are not questions that were asked at the time, not publicly at least, because from the outside, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. New roles, new attention, a growing presence in a world that valued exactly the kind of raw, unfiltered energy she carried. But beneath that surface, something else was forming, a dynamic, one that would soon define not only her career, but her identity, her relationships, and perhaps even the trajectory of her entire life. Because not long after arriving in France, she would meet someone who saw her not just as she was, but as something she could become. And that's when things began to change in ways no one fully understood at the time. Because sometimes the most important turning points don't feel dramatic when they happen. They feel subtle, almost accidental, until you look back and realize everything shifted in that moment. There are moments in a life when everything seems to accelerate at once, when identity, opportunity, and perception begin to merge into something larger than the person at the center of it. For Jane Birkin, that moment didn't arrive quietly. It arrived through a connection that would define her in ways few could have predicted. His name was Serge Gainsbourg. At the time, he was already a force within French culture, enigmatic, provocative, deeply respected, and equally controversial. He wasn't simply a musician, he was an architect of image, of sound, of persona. And when he met Birkin, something clicked. Not just romantically, but creatively. Or at least, that's how the story is usually told. But something didn't add up, because from the outside, their partnership appeared almost perfectly balanced. The older, experienced artist guiding the younger, emerging figure. The intellectual and the instinctive. The composer and the muse. It was a narrative that made sense, clean, compelling, easy to understand. Too easy, perhaps, because when you look closer, the dynamic becomes harder to define. Their collaboration produced one of the most infamous songs of its time, Je t'aime, moi non plus. A track that blurred the line between intimacy and performance so completely that it unsettled audiences across Europe. Banned in multiple countries, condemned by institutions, celebrated by others as bold, revolutionary, fearless. But what they didn't tell us was how that moment felt from the inside. Because the song didn't just introduce Birkin to the world, it defined her. It attached her identity to something provocative, something controversial, something that would follow her for the rest of her life. Her voice, soft and breathless, became inseparable from the image it created. And once that image was established, it was almost impossible to escape. And that's when things became even stranger. Because while her fame grew rapidly, the control over that image didn't always seem to belong entirely to her. Gainsbourg was not only her partner, he was her creator in a sense. He wrote for her, shaped her roles, guided her presence in the public eye. He understood how to build myth, but at what cost? Because the more visible she became, the more her identity seemed to narrow. She wasn't just Jane Birkin anymore. She was the voice, the face, the symbol of a certain kind of artistic daring. A role that the world embraced, but one that may not have fully reflected who she was beneath it. And yet she played it perfectly. Interviews, performances, films. She moved through them with a kind of natural ease that made everything feel authentic, as if nothing was forced, as if this was simply who she had always been. But authenticity can be deceptive, because sometimes the most convincing performances are the ones that blur into reality. And if you pay attention to the quieter details, the pauses between words, the subtle hesitations, the moments where her expression seemed to shift, you begin to notice something else. Attention. Not overt, not dramatic, but present. Because while the world saw a partnership, there were hints of imbalance. Gainsbourg's personality was intense, unpredictable, often dominating. His influence extended beyond music, shaping the environments they inhabited, the narratives that surrounded them. And Birkin adapted. That's the word that appears again and again when tracing her life. Adaptation. Adjustment. A willingness to move with the current rather than against it. But adaptation over time can become something else. It can become a quiet form of surrender. And this is where the hidden pattern begins to emerge. Because the rise of Jane Birkin wasn't just about success, it was about transformation. A continuous reshaping of identity in response to the forces around her. Each step forward came with a subtle shift, away from who she had been, and toward something constructed, refined, externalized. And the question is, did she choose that path fully? Or was she in some ways carried into it? The world didn't ask that question. Because from the outside, everything looked extraordinary. Film roles expanded her presence. Music solidified her influence. Fashion turned her into a reference point, an enduring symbol of effortless elegance. She became timeless. But timelessness often comes at the expense of something more fragile, something human. Because to remain an icon, one must remain consistent, recognizable, fixed in a certain form that the world can hold on to. And yet, real people are not fixed. They change, they evolve, they fracture. And when those changes don't align with the image, they tend to disappear from view. By the time her fame had fully crystallized, Birkin was no longer just living her life. She was representing something, an idea, a feeling, a version of freedom that others projected onto her. But what they didn't see was what it took to maintain that. Because behind the music, behind the films, behind the carefully captured photographs, there were moments that didn't fit the narrative, moments of doubt, of exhaustion, of quiet withdrawal, moments that didn't belong in the myth. And those moments began to accumulate, slowly, almost invisibly, until they started to leave traces, not enough for the public to notice, but enough to suggest that something beneath the surface wasn't as stable as it seemed, because every rise, no matter how effortless it appears, carries within it the seeds of its own instability. And in Birkin's case, those seeds had already begun to take root. The world just hadn't seen them yet, but they were there, waiting. By the time Jane Birkin's image had settled into something the world could instantly recognize, the illusion had become almost complete. She was no longer just an artist moving through phases of life. She was a constant, a symbol that didn't seem to age, didn't seem to fracture, didn't seem to carry the same weight of consequence as everyone else. But symbols are not real, and eventually reality begins to press back. At first, the cracks were subtle, easy to overlook, the kind of shifts that only become visible in hindsight. Her relationship with Serge Gainsbourg, so central to her rise, began to change in ways that were difficult to define publicly. Their chemistry, once described as electric, started to carry a different tone. Less harmony, more tension. But something didn't add up. Because even as signs of strain appeared, the narrative around them remained almost unchanged. They were still seen as an iconic pairing, still celebrated, still referenced as if nothing fundamental had shifted. And that's when things became even stranger. Because behind that image, accounts began to surface, quietly, almost cautiously, of a relationship that was far more volatile than it appeared. Gainsbourg's behavior, described by some as unpredictable, even destructive at times, created an environment that wasn't always stable. Moments of affection existed, certainly, but so did moments of imbalance, of emotional intensity that blurred into something harder to manage. And Birkin stayed for years, which raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Why? Because from the outside, she had everything she needed to walk away. Recognition, independence, a growing career that no longer depended entirely on him, and yet the connection held. Perhaps because it wasn't just a relationship, it was an identity. Walking away from Gainsbourg wouldn't just mean ending a partnership, it would mean stepping out of the version of herself that the world had come to know. The version that had been shaped, refined, and amplified through that connection. And leaving that behind is never simple. But eventually, the separation came, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet shift. A slow disentangling that left behind something more complicated than closure. Because even after they parted, his influence didn't disappear. It lingered. In the music, in the perception of who she was, in the way the world continued to frame her story. And that's where the fractures began to deepen. Because without that defining partnership, Birkin was faced with something she hadn't fully confronted before. Herself. Not the image, not the symbol, but the person beneath it. And that's when the narrative starts to change. Her life in the years that followed was marked not by a single dramatic event, but by a series of emotional shifts, losses, transitions, moments that carried weight but didn't always make headlines. Relationships came and went. Roles evolved. Her presence in the public eye softened, became less about provocation and more about reflection. But something didn't fully settle, because even as she moved forward, there were signs that the past hadn't entirely released its hold. Interviews hinted at complexity, at memories that weren't easily categorized as good or bad, at a lingering connection to something that had both elevated and destabilized her. And then came the losses, the kind that don't just alter your life, but redefine it. The death of her daughter, Kate Barry, in 2013 marked a moment that cannot be understood simply as grief. It was something deeper, more disorienting, a rupture that cut through everything else, career, identity, public image, and left behind something raw and unprotected. Because no matter how composed a life may appear, there are events that break through every layer of control. And this was one of them. After that, those who observed her closely began to notice a shift. Not dramatic, not overt, but present. A kind of quiet heaviness that settled into her demeanor. A slowing down. A withdrawal that wasn't announced, but felt. And that's when the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Because when you trace the trajectory of her life, from early displacement to rapid reinvention, to a rise shaped by powerful external forces, to relationships that carried imbalance, to losses that left deep emotional marks, you begin to see something that doesn't fit the original narrative. This wasn't just a story of effortless success. It was a story of accumulation, of pressures, of adaptations, of moments that required her to reshape herself again and again until the line between who she was and what she represented became increasingly difficult to define. And yet the world continued to see her the same way, as timeless, as untouched, as if none of it had changed her. But that's not how real lives work. Because even the most carefully maintained image cannot fully contain what happens beneath it. And in Birkin's case, what was happening beneath the surface was becoming more complex with each passing year, more layered, more difficult to reconcile. Until eventually, it led to a question that no one had fully asked before. Not about her career, not about her relationships, but about something far more unsettling. What happens to a person when they spend a lifetime becoming what the world expects, while slowly losing connection to what they truly are? And more importantly, what remains when that process reaches its limit? There is rarely a single moment where a life changes completely. What we call a turning point is often something much quieter, something that builds over time, layer by layer, until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. And in the case of Jane Birkin, that moment wasn't defined by one event, but by a slow convergence of everything that had come before it. By the time she entered the later years of her life, the image remained intact. To the world, she was still the same figure, graceful, understated, effortlessly present. Her voice, though softer now, still carried that familiar fragility. Her face, lined with time, only seemed to deepen the sense of authenticity people had always admired. If anything, she appeared more real than ever. But something didn't add up, because behind that image, the structure supporting it had begun to weaken. Physically, she was no longer the same. Health issues had started to emerge, subtle at first, then more persistent. Fatigue became a quiet companion. Appearances grew less frequent. There were cancellations, delays, moments where she seemed to retreat without explanation. And that's when things became even stranger. Because despite these signs, the narrative surrounding her barely shifted. The world continued to see continuity, an unbroken line from past to present, as if time had simply passed without altering anything essential. But time always alters something. And in Birkin's case, what it altered was not immediately visible, because what was changing wasn't just physical, it was internal. The loss of her daughter, Kate Barry, had already created a fracture that never fully healed. Grief, unlike other emotions, does not follow a predictable path. It doesn't resolve. It settles. It reshapes everything around it. And for Birkin, that reshaping was profound. Those closest to her would later describe a shift, not in her character but in her energy, a quiet absence where something once lived. A sense that part of her had withdrawn, even while she continued to move through the world as expected. But what they didn't tell us was how that absence evolves over time. Because grief doesn't stay the same. It deepens. It integrates. It becomes part of the structure of who you are. And when combined with the pressures of a life lived in constant visibility, it creates a tension that is difficult to sustain indefinitely. And that tension was building. In interviews, she spoke more openly about exhaustion, about the weight of memory, about the difficulty of continuing forward when certain parts of the past could never be restored. Her words were measured, never overly dramatic, but there was a clarity to them that hadn't been present before, a kind of quiet acknowledgement, and yet even then the full picture remained just out of reach. Because alongside the emotional weight, there were also signs of something else: isolation. Not in the obvious sense. She was still surrounded by people, still recognized, still admired. But isolation can exist even in the presence of others. It's not about being alone. It's about being unseen in the ways that matter. And that's when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because when you look at the final years of her life, not as separate events, but as part of a continuous arc, you begin to see how everything connects. The early need to adapt, the identity shaped through powerful relationships, the gradual accumulation of emotional strain, the losses that redefined her sense of self. All of it leading here, not to a sudden collapse, but to a quiet narrowing. A life that once expanded in every direction, slowly drawing inward, becoming smaller, more contained, more fragile. And then the final chapter. There was no dramatic announcement. No moment that signaled the end was approaching. just a series of increasingly subtle withdrawals. Fewer appearances, longer periods of absence, a sense that something was receding, though no one could quite say what. Until it stopped. She was found in her home in Paris, alone. The official explanations were simple. Natural causes, a life that had reached its conclusion. Nothing unexpected, nothing that required deeper investigation. But something didn't add up. Because when a life carries this much complexity, this many layers, this many unresolved tensions, it rarely ends in a way that feels completely explained. And yet, that's how it was presented. A peaceful passing, an inevitable outcome, a closing chapter that aligned neatly with the narrative the world had always believed. But what if that narrative was incomplete? What if the final moment wasn't just the result of age or health, but the culmination of something much longer? Something that had been building quietly, almost invisibly, for decades? Because endings don't exist in isolation. They are shaped by everything that comes before them. And if you trace that path, if you follow it carefully, without the filters of myth or expectation, you begin to see that her final years were not simply a period of decline. They were a reflection of a life lived between identities, of a person who became something extraordinary, while gradually losing something essential along the way. And that raises a question that lingers long after the details fade. Not about how she died, but about what had already been slipping away long before anyone noticed. Because by the time the world realized she was gone, part of her may have already disappeared years earlier. In the days that followed the death of Jane Birkin, the world responded exactly as expected. Tributes arrived in waves. Headlines described her as timeless, effortless, irreplaceable. Clips of her voice resurfaced, that same soft, almost fragile tone that once felt so intimate it blurred the line between performance and reality. Photographs circulated again, youthful, radiant, untouched by time, as if the decades in between had never fully existed. It was a perfect narrative, too perfect, because what we were seeing wasn't her life. It was her image. And that's when things become even more unsettling, because the more the world tried to preserve that image, the more it seemed to erase everything that didn't fit inside it. The complexities, the contradictions, the quiet struggles that never made it into the official version of her story. But something didn't add up, because if her life had truly been as seamless as it was now being remembered, why did so many fragments of it feel unresolved? Why did her final years carry a weight that didn't align with the simplicity of the narrative being presented? And perhaps more importantly, why did her story feel incomplete, even in death? Because when you look beyond the tributes, when you move past the carefully selected moments that define public memory, you begin to notice something else. A pattern of disappearance, not physical at first, but emotional, gradual, almost invisible. Because Jane Birkin didn't vanish all at once. She didn't suddenly step out of the life she had built. Instead, parts of her seemed to recede over time, quietly withdrawing behind the image that continued to exist. The girl who once moved between cultures, searching for where she belonged. The woman who adapted, reshaped herself, became what the world responded to. The mother who carried loss in a way that could never be fully expressed. Each version of her didn't disappear completely, but they became harder to see, until what remained was something refined, recognizable, but incomplete. And that raises a question that lingers long after the story ends. What happens when a person becomes more visible to the world than they are to themselves? Because visibility, in its purest form, is not the same as being known. It is not the same as being understood. And over time, the gap between those two things can become difficult to reconcile. In Birkin's case, that gap may have been the hidden truth that followed her throughout her life, a quiet distance between who she was and what she represented. And that distance didn't collapse. It expanded, slowly, subtly, without drawing attention, until it became part of the structure of her existence. And that's what makes her story different from the way it is often told. Because this is not simply a story about fame, or success, or even tragedy in the conventional sense. It is a story about erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't leave obvious traces, the kind that can exist even in a life that appears, from the outside, to be full. Because what we celebrate is often the surface, the image, the voice, the moments that can be captured and replayed. But beneath that surface, there are always things we don't see. And in some cases, those unseen elements are the ones that matter most. After her death, discussions briefly touched on her health, her age, the natural explanations that provide closure. But those explanations only address the final moment. They do not explain the path that led there. And that path, when viewed as a whole, feels less like a series of isolated events and more like a continuous process, a gradual narrowing, a life that began with openness and possibility, slowly shaped by external forces, internal adaptations, and emotional weight, until what remained was something both familiar and distant at the same time. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Because there was no single point where everything changed, no clear moment where the story shifted from light to shadow. Instead, it happened gradually, so gradually that no one, not the public, not even those closest to her, could fully see it as it was happening. And by the time it became visible, it was already complete. Which leaves us with the final question. Not about Jane Birkin as an icon, not about her legacy as an artist, but about something far more difficult to define. How much of a life can disappear, while the image of it continues to exist? Because if her story tells us anything, it's this. What we remember is not always what was real, and what was real is often the part that fades first.